Welcome to Lab 1, Introduction to AWS IAM. I'm Richard Golson, and I wanted to go over this with you to give you an understanding about how you can work with AWS IAM, particularly with this Lab 1, it being our first lab. We're going to have a few things we're going to want to be mindful of as we're working through here, so we'll point those out as well. Now, IAM is a web service that enables AWS customers to manage their users and user permissions in AWS. With IAM, we can centrally manage our users, their security credentials, such as their access keys, and the permissions that control which AWS resources those users can access. In this lab, we're going to be demonstrating the user 1, user 2, user 3, and how by placing them in the EC2 admin group, EC2 support group, and S3 support group with attached policies that are unique for each group, we can provide what we call least privilege, so least privilege access. So the users in each of those groups would be able to handle the tasks they need to be able to handle within AWS, but be prevented from accessing other resources and tasks that are not part of their job description, so to speak. We're going to experiment with the effects of these policies on that service access. We're also going to be locating and using the IAM sign-in URL in the AWS Management Console. The first part of this lab covers task 1, exploring the users and groups. And so in this task, what we're going to be doing is looking at those different users, looking at a summary, and looking at the groups, and looking at the security credentials. So let me go ahead and open up the IAM console. And you'll see that I have links down here that allow me to go right over to users or to the groups. I'm going to go to the main page so you can see what it looks like. Here we can see that we have those 3 user groups that have been mentioned. There's actually 4 users. And then there's 14 roles, a single policy, etc. I'm going to click on the user groups in the navigator, and I'll see briefly the 3 groups that were mentioned. Clicking on the users, I can see the 3 users plus an AWS student. I can safely ignore that one. Now, I can oftentimes move these around to make things fit a little better. It looks like I'm kind of blocked there. So what I'm going to do is close the navigator so that I can see this a little bit better. And you can see that this is a fairly new user that was created specifically for this lab, because all of the timers are in less than 10 minutes. So these were created for the lab. Now, what I want to do is click on the user 1 link. I have a summary page of that user 1. I'll go ahead and close that up again. And you can see that we have different pieces of information, such as their resource number. Each user gets their own unique resource number. This user has an access key that's never been used, and that user is never logged in. This is what you would see every time you ran this lab, because each user will be created at the time the lab's created, and their ARN will be unique. So in fact, even though it has the same name, it is a brand new unique user, IAM user account. Down below, we can see the permissions. There are no permissions assigned to this user, so they have no rights, no access. Here we can see the groups, not currently a member of a group. Security credentials, a unique sign-in link. See, a console password was updated 9 minutes ago. They've set the password for us. We'll see that a little bit later. And so at this stage, we've examined this. Let's go ahead and get going here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add this user 1 to one of these groups. In fact, we should take a look at these groups one more time. Here's the user groups, and you can see the 3 user groups. If I select each group in turn, it should show me that there's no users. So I'll go ahead and select the EC2 admin group, close up the navigator, no user attached to that group. If I wanted to add a user, I could do it right here. Here's the permissions. It shows me that this group has permissions. This is following best practice. Typically, what we want to do is assign the permissions to a group and then put the user in the group so that way they get the access rights based upon what that group should be able to do. In this case, EC2 admin, meaning they get to administer those users. Now, if I get to administer EC2, not users, excuse me, I'm going to click the plus. And if we scroll up, we can see that this is the permissions that are allowed. So the effect is to allow on all resources that are that are part of the EC2 service. So this allows us to describe, start instances, and stop instances. So this is going to give us a limited set of actions for the EC2 service because that's what these actions are related to. So it's allowing any member, any user that's a member of the group to be able to do these things. Now, what's great is if I make changes to this policy, update the policy, this would update any of this information, and that's immediately available to be applied to any users that are a member of the group. Let's scroll down here, and we can take a look at the rest of the groups. So click open on that, go back to my user groups. And so we were looking at the EC2 admin. We're going to take a look at the EC2 support. Let's take a look at the permissions there. No users. There's the permissions. If I expand this a little bit, it's EC2 read-only access. So we can start and stop EC2 instances with the other group. But the EC2 support group gets read-only actions. And what that means is that they can describe, meaning they'll be able to view the resources in the EC2 console. And we'll see this later on. And we have some other things around elastic load balancing for describing. We're getting some metric information on all resources, but it's all describing. So it's very limited. It's read-only, right? And then if we click on the user group breadcrumb trail here, rather than using the navigator, I can go to my S3 support. And as you can imagine, the permissions are all going to be about S3, getting, listing, describing. Notice there are some S3 object lambda. Don't worry about that right now. All the actions are relevant to S3. And it looks like the ability to get information without necessarily the ability to create resources within there. Again, this is an S3 support position. All right, so we essentially have reviewed the user's capabilities in terms of any groups that they might join. And we're going to come back on the next video and actually take a look at the business scenario and start putting the users in groups and see what happens from there. All right, we'll see you in the next video.